you can't force a person to grow. It has to be voluntary. That other person, perhaps you listening to this at this point in time, has to have that inkling. You have to decide, I am now ready to grow, to make that change. But that does still beg the question of how are you going to make that change? And that's the whole purpose of today's book recommendation, is to help provide you with an ongoing and constantly updating set of guidelines and propositions that can help you to navigate the challenges as you move from the person that you were towards the person you want to become, realizing that once you actually get there, you'll want to become a slightly different type of person anyway. So what are the guidelines and what are the rules that need to update as we go through all of this? So the book that I'm recommending for today is Toward a Psychology of Being by Abraham Maslow. You might potentially have heard of Maslow already, perhaps from his very famous triangle, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which goes through the basic levels of what is it that you need to survive, such as food and as shelter, all the way through to self-actualization at the very, very top of the pyramid. We're focusing much more towards the self-actualization end in a video like this and in a series like this as well. But that might be where you've potentially come across this name Maslow before. And this book is absolutely brilliant. He writes with a beautifully precise technicality. He's always referring to this idea of what is the optimum way that a human being should operate, rather than it just being how most authors would say, like, what's the best way of living, or how should I live? It's written in a much more of a technical but not off-putting way, and it's just so useful and it's just so practical. And there's one thing I want to really focus on in this book, which is on page 46, which is going to be quite similar to the previous video in this series, when in ACT we talked about this idea of a choice point and how do we go from making decisions towards the future that we want rather than away from the future that we are looking for. And this is going to be a very, very similar idea, but taken to that next level. So that way you can see how a lot of these books are actually very complementary to each other. And once there is an idea that has been raised in one book, you can actually see how it can be taken further as well into the next one. So what we're looking at on here is, I don't know how well this is going to show up, but I'm referring to just at the top of page 46, just this little diagram on here, where you've got a person in the middle, and on the left of the line, you've got a safety, and on the right, you've got growth. So what you need to be doing constantly, and this is something that I've used all the time in my life, definitely on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis, is considering these 4 points. What we need to move towards, ideally, obviously, is the growth element of all of this. And we need to consider 4 things. Firstly, how do we enhance the growth vectors? Not factors. How do we enhance the growth vectors? So basically, what is it that is enticing about this future that I want to move towards? How can I make that crystal clear in my head? Exactly why do I want this? And then part 2 of that then is minimizing the fears of growth. So you could do this as a journal or as a practical exercise as I'm talking through it now. How do we maximize exactly what it is that we want by making it really, really clear? But also, how do we minimize the fear around that as well? So if, let's say, you're looking to start a business, then what is it that business will allow you to do or to be or to have in the future? Make it really, really clear how it's going to benefit you. And when you consider this idea of minimizing the fears of growth, try to think about it as, okay, there is the very real option and potential that this business might not succeed, but how do we minimize that fear in relation to how good it would be if it was to be successful? Because if you have a very strong sense of why you are doing this, you'll be able to naturally coach yourself through some of those fears. But you need to at least acknowledge them, otherwise they'll be somewhere in the back of your head pulling the strings in your unconscious mind without you really being aware of them. So this is why we need to really draw all of this out. So first 2 points towards the growth element: enhance the growth vectors and minimize the fears of growth. And then on the other side, we're literally just doing the exact opposite. So in terms of safety, if you just think about it in terms of, let's say you decided not to act, you decided not to go for that big decision, you decided not to set up that business, then if you're trying to convince yourself to move towards that decision, what you need to start doing then is minimizing the safety vectors. You need to start thinking about why it would be quite bad for you to not set up this business. Why you need to try to think about it as, even though it's uncertain, how can I still lean towards it? And actually, if I think about what would happen if I didn't act, then how bad would that be for me? How dysfunctional would it be in the long run? What would happen a year, 2, 5 years down the line if I decided not to do that? And again, you're not lying to yourself with all of this. You're just making it clear. You're just putting down the reasons and putting down your thoughts to make it really clear and obvious. And then last part of all this, so we've minimized the safety vectors on this side, and we're also trying to maximize the fear of safety. Same with defensiveness and what he refers to in here as well as pathology and regression. So in that case there, maximizing the fear, you could think about it as, well, how much money could you earn by setting up your own business, as opposed to how much money that you are earning right now, assuming that you're unhappy with it. What is it that all this extra money would allow you to do in the future, and how would that help you to show up in the world differently as a more self-actualized version of yourself, rather than someone who is just acting in a more survival-based mindset? That's what we're trying to consider with all of this. So in the previous video, we talked about the choice point being here, and we can either move towards a future or away from a future, get hooked away from it. It's essentially the same thing as we're talking about in this, but it's just going to be a slightly different diagram. So the choice point is in the middle, and how do we move towards the growth end, and how do we move away from the safety end? And that's why this is so useful, because we can use this over and over and over again. By the time you've set up that business, different problems will turn up. You're never going to get to a stage where there are no new problems. So as a result, we start to repeat the process. And if you're not quite sure about what it is that you want to do in the future or become in the future, then again, this is exactly why a book like this is absolutely brilliant, because it starts to refer to what he calls a being cognition, or be cognition. It's the idea of what is it that we want to move towards in a full sense, so that we can understand who we are as a being, rather than being motivated by deficiency, or what he might refer to as D values. So again, it's the same kind of idea. B values, being values, how do we prioritize those? Things like love and joy and openness and everything that's positive that we really want. And how do we move away from deficiency-based values, which is much more of like the negative versions there. So how do we avoid fear? How do we avoid disaster? It's much more avoidance-based when we start to talk about it like that. And that's what makes this book really, really fascinating to read compared to every other book that I've recommended so far, because he starts to make it really clear in a scientific way about what the ideal human specimen should look like and how you can actually get there as well. The book actually literally starts, and you can see I've highlighted this page here quite heavily, with a set of propositions and a set of rules, which is just some assumptions that we can start to test. So in this case, we can start to think about it as, what is it that is true for me? What is it that's true of all humans? And what's true for self-actualized humans? Humans that have got through all the basic desires and are now looking towards fulfillment, who are looking towards this higher ideal. If you want a little bonus recommendation with all this as well, if you like a book like this and you like the scientific sort of method and process with it all, his follow-up book, which just takes this a little bit further, so from not just self-actualization but then self-transcendence, then The Farther Reaches of Human Nature is a great little follow-up if you are interested in this. Just to be clear, the book recommendation for this video is this particular one, but that's a great little idea if you want to take it further. Because as we start to look at all this, you can then start to see, what is it that are some of the basic rules that I need to live by? And as long as I live by these as guiding rules, guiding principles, then not much can go wrong. And we can update this all the time. The last chapter in this book is 43 separate propositions that if you followed them, then it's going to move you towards growth. It's going to move you away from safety. And with all of this, that means that we're going to move towards self-actualization. And it's so positively worded with all of this as well. None of this is about blame. None of this is about regret or deep shame. It's just saying, here's where we are, and here's how we move towards, as I keep saying with all of this, a desired future. It's based on this idea that we've all got these capacities that are within us that, to use the phrasing from this book, that clamour to be used. If we're feeling this angst or this anxiety or this frustration or this unsettledness in our body, it's because we know we've got these capacities that we could be using that could actually develop us, but we're not using them for some reason. And what the point of something like this is to make it really, really clear as to why we need to use them, but also how we can then start to use them as well. This is essentially like a set of guidelines and propositions about what all humans ultimately should really work towards, having looked at people who have experienced peak experiences, when they've experienced certain highs, which they can then integrate back into their everyday sense of being so that they can live in that constant way of being rather than of deficiency. Of this idea of higher joys and loves and of pleasures rather than being motivated by just purely survival-based needs. This is going to be, it's very, very difficult to summarize a book like this, but this, I would say, combined with two other books in this series, would make a fantastic little trilogy to be able to go through who you are, where you are right now, and who you could become. And that's actually going to be the next video in this series, just to finish off this full book recommendation of just 3 books where if you can combine them all together, then you've got a full system for deep healing that you can use over and over and over again. And it's going to cost you pennies if you just buy 3 books compared to paying for coaching or paying for therapy, which might get too expensive and you might be in a situation where you can't afford it. So as we're looking at this, Toward a Psychology of Being by Abraham Maslow is going to give you all of the structure that you need to make sense of your life, to make sense of where it is that you want to go and how you're going to get there. And more importantly, what type of person that you should aim to be once you get there as well. Because ultimately, once you get there, you're going to be thinking of other places to go anyway. So it's much more about the process rather than the product. Think about yourself as the process of that journey rather than just the product of any particular goal that you are on that journey itself. So book 15 in this series, Toward a Psychology of Being by Abraham Maslow. And like I say, if you do like that, I would definitely recommend the follow-up as well, The Farther Reaches of Human Nature.